What up? Welcome to GSM. I'm glad you made it. Like, legit, I didn't know how many of you were going to make it tonight. I didn't know if I was making it tonight. So I'm glad you're here. You braved the storm. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I guess we'll see if you make it home. But I am glad you're here for the moment. So while we're here, I pray that you just open up yourself, honestly, your heart, to what God has for us tonight. Because we're continuing in this series, That's Not in There. And Sean kicked it off last week, and he crushed it. He did such a good job opening up God's word and showing us that some things that we think are true don't actually line up to what God has said. And tonight I'm going to continue in that. But first I need you to check out this video. All right. Now I have some questions. How did that video make you feel? Nostalgic. Oh, you guys are nostalgic. Okay. To me, that was 100 songs in like a minute and a half that recapped the last decade. And I don't know if you were like me, but I felt overwhelmed watching that. It's like I could have closed my eyes and listened to it alone, and just the audio, how quick it was, how mushed together it was, all of that would have made me feel like overwhelmed. And if I opened my eyes, I would have been twice as lost in whatever that was, that craziness. And I wish I didn't have to tell you how long Sean and I looked for a video that would make us feel this weird inside. But it took us way too long. So that's what we get paid to do, I guess. Look for terrible YouTube videos. And we found this video. And I hope in some senses it did lead you to feel overwhelmed. Because that's what we're talking about tonight. Is when you and I, as people, we get overwhelmed. Another word we might interchangeably use tonight is overburdened. Because the statement we're looking at tonight for the series part 2, that's not in there, is God won't give you more than you can handle. I think this statement is what we would call a Christian cliche. The same way Sean last week said that the Christian life might be easy. We know both of these not to be true, but they become a Christian cliche because people commonly say them and they think they're true, and they think they're helpful. But in reality, they're not. They're said with good intent. If you've ever been a person to say, God won't give you more than you can handle, if someone's ever said that to you, I honestly do think that these words are uttered with good intent behind them, from people with pure hearts that want to help people, but they're untrue. They sound good. To be honest, sometimes I wish they were true, but they lack the substance that we need. And when it comes down to it, I actually think statements like this do damage to the Christian life and to people we might say them to. So the truth is, we feel overwhelmed a lot in life. And that was kind of a silly example if you were watching the video and you felt overwhelmed like I did. But if you were to sit here and reflect on your life, maybe even today or this last week, chances are there was probably a moment you could pick out that you felt overwhelmed. In my examples, I could tell you would be like, anytime I leave the country. I have been blessed to be able to go some really cool places. I've been to Haiti twice and Mexico twice, Africa once, and I got to go to Europe last year, right before the pandemic. It was crazy. And in all of these trips, my wife is a little bit more explorer than I am. She's willing to just kind of just try it and figure it out. Like, she kind of speaks Spanish, so we're like, oh, we'll go to Spain, it'll work out. She just answered every question with sí. It's like, no, don't just respond with whatever anyways, but I felt a little overwhelmed because I don't speak the language in any of these places. I don't know the directions. I don't know how to get around. So one of the stories that I'll just quick tell is if you ever had the chance to go to Haiti, it's an amazing country. It honestly is. It's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, is why so many mission trip groups go there. But it also has some incredible people. And when I've gotten the chance to go there, I've gotten to meet a lot of them. But to get to Haiti, you got to fly into their airport. And their airport is not like any American airport I've ever been to. It's not like any European or African or Mexican airport I've ever been to. It is a Haitian airport. And when you pull up, you get off the plane and you're kind of just ushered through back channels, and it's kind of super sketchy. And eventually you get to this place, where you would pick up your luggage, because that's kind of what you do. The luggage flies under the plane, so you got to claim it at some point. And I went to go claim my luggage with the group I was with. And at the Haiti airport, they have a different kind of way to pick up your luggage. You're not allowed to just go and grab it off the carousel. You can't just walk up and be like, yo, that's my bag. All right, take it, go, you're on your way. Instead, you usually And I don't know if you have to do this, but it really felt like I had to. You have to pay this person who has a cart. They go get your luggage, and you just pray that they bring it back. And in your mind, you're probably like, oh, that's probably nice. You know, you just hand someone $5, they get your luggage for you. It's not nice. There's like hundreds of people just running around this area, just constantly trying to get you to pay them to get your luggage. And I'm not talking just like one or two people will come up and ask, and they're speaking a different language, and they're grabbing your hand, and they're leading you different places. And all of this just to get your bag that is your bag. And in the end, you just hope so bad that they grab the right bag and somehow you make it out of this airport. And in those moments, I felt overwhelmed, and it was a little bit more serious. And in other moments, I've had family members get sick. I've had family members pass away. I've dealt with hard things in life. And in some of those moments, I felt really overwhelmed. And I don't know what yours are, what you think of when you start to think what you might feel or what made you feel overwhelmed. But I do know sometimes we get into this habit where we let pride step in, and we want our pride to take care of our feelings of being overwhelmed. And I don't know if it's necessarily our Midwest nice or our keeping it to ourselves, or it's like this American individualistic, I can handle it kind of mentality. But we want to bottle it all up, and we want to just deal with it and make sure it goes away. And I think out of that, we birth this idea that God won't give us more than we can handle, because I'm just going to take care of it myself. But again, I think it's wrong. Sean said last week that following Jesus is easy. And then he went on to prove how that's not at all true. And he did it using this verse from John 10:10. And Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. He also looked at it in the ESV, and he showed us how it could be not full but abundant. And how life with Jesus, while there's joy and there's peace and there's hope, and it's honestly just the best way to live, it doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. Another verse he could have used would have been Matthew 11:30. And Jesus is talking, and he lays out this idea, and he finishes that idea by saying, for my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. And people combine those two ideas, and they get to this place where they're going to say, following Jesus is easy. Jesus is going to take your problems away. It's going to be an awesome, easy, perfect life following him. But again, that's a wrong interpretation of a couple different scriptures. Because I think that's what happens when we get to these Christian cliches. They start with some level of truth, and then they move off of that truth, and they become wrong interpretations, and they've lost their way, and they're not aligned with what the Bible actually says. So tonight, in 1 Corinthians 10, and in 2 verses 12 to 13, we're going to see an idea that starts in truth and how it can be kind of twisted and moved to get to this idea that God won't give you more than you can handle. So I'll read it to you. And it's Paul, and he says, so if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall into temptation. For no temptation has overcome you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Do you see in that text where maybe this idea would come from? I had to dig a little bit for it, but really when you look at it, I think it comes right from those words that it says, he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. Because that sounds kind of like he won't give you more than you can handle. If we're being honest, those two ideas maybe line up. But I'm going to tell you, they actually don't. And they don't line up because Paul here is talking about a very specific issue. And this is why in church, if a pastor comes up and he starts to give you just these different references and these different verses, I hope most of the time he gives you a little context from them. He or she gives you a little context for them. And for this, the context is Paul is addressing to the church some of the different sin they were living in. And when he's addressing this sin, he's telling them that they won't be tempted beyond what they can bear. And it's similar to the idea, but this whole verse, it's about temptation, not about being overwhelmed or overburdened. And if we were to define temptations is simply a desire to do something that's wrong or unwise. Like if you're tempted to do something, I mean, you could be tempted to good things, but for the most part in this context, When you're tempted to do something, it's something that's wrong or unwise. We would maybe call that sin. And in these temptations, Paul is telling you that God will not tempt you beyond, he will not let you be tempted, beyond what you can bear. He'll always provide a way out. He'll always make sure you can endure it. So maybe there's one question I'm going to ask later. Maybe it's a temptation in your life you can think of in this moment. This sin that you've struggled with. This thing you keep falling back into. These words give us hope. They give us hope that God wants us to be able to overcome those temptations. That he is going to help us so that we can endure it. But it doesn't say anything about burdens or feeling overwhelmed. And when we go back to that first statement, I'll say it again. This idea that God won't give you more than you can handle. There's two issues that I see right away with believing this statement. And the first one is an issue of theological confusion. And I'll explain, Sean used this word last week too, and I love it. Theology is something you might hear in the church. And theology is simply kind of what we think about God. Like the same way you might study biology. Biology is the study of life. So it's going to reorient and fix your way of how you think about life. Theology is going to help you understand and think about God. So right away we have a theological confusion that elicits itself out of this statement. So something about the way we think about God is wrong if we believe that God won't give us more than we can handle. And I think it's this. I think we get to the point where we start to think that God gives us all of our problems. That everything I feel, every heartache, every burden, every time I feel overwhelmed, if I start to believe God won't give me more than I can handle, then I'm making that jump there that must come from God. But not everything in this life that is hard or broken or overwhelming or a burden, that doesn't all come from God. God does not give you all of these issues that you have in life. We're going to look at that a bit in a second. But the second issue that I see with this original statement is that it can bring out some emotional guilt for us. And the emotional guilt comes from this fact, someone might say this to you, hey, I know it's hard, I know you're going through something, but God won't give you more than you can handle. And for you in that moment, hearing that, you might be like, but this, what I'm feeling, it's more than I can handle. This problem I'm dealing with, it's more than I can handle. So then our mind jumps, and we start to say, well, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me if God won't give me something more than I can handle, but yet I feel like I can't handle this? Why can't I get it right? Why can't I fix the problem? Why can't I pull myself up by my bootstraps? Why can't I move on? But there's nothing wrong with you if you ever feel overwhelmed. There's nothing wrong with that. Paul, one of the people who wrote a huge chunk of the New Testament, in 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 9, he says, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we have experienced in the province of Asia. We are under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure. They thought they might lose their lives. Indeed, we had received the sentence of death. But this happened that we may not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Paul, in his own words, is telling you a story of a time he felt overburdened, overwhelmed beyond what he thought he could bear. So then there's this truth that God won't let you be tempted beyond your measure. He's going to give you a way out, but he may let you be overburdened. Because we live in a broken world. And I don't want to stay here too long, but in Genesis 3, we see Adam and Eve eat the fruit from the tree. I hope you've heard this story. If you haven't, tune in, because this is a huge chunk of our entire existence in the way the world functions. We live in a broken world, and this broken world has consequences that still show up today. So the hardships of life, the things that make us feel overburdened and overwhelmed, they don't always come from God, but sometimes they just come from the consequences of living in a creation that's not functioning the way it was supposed to. So when your school gets too hard, sometimes you could just blame it on sin. When your relationships with your friends or your family get hard, or even if a friendship falls apart and it's not the same as it used to be, when a relationship breaks up, when people get sick and they may even pass away, it's not always just God's fault. Sometimes it's just the consequences of living in a broken world. And I know that is incredibly super disheartening. If I finished that message there, I wouldn't like the message I just preached. But there's a big old but right after that entire idea. And this but comes in John 16:33. Jesus is sharing, and he says, I have told you these things so that you may have peace. Peace being almost the opposite of feeling overwhelmed. And he said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, Jesus says. I have overcome the world. I have overcome the world, Jesus says. Because in his life that he lived perfectly with you in mind, he went to the cross and he died the death we deserved, taking the punishment we deserved. And he rose from the grave again with you in mind, loving you, caring for you. And he overcomes all evil, all brokenness, and has victory forever. That's what we call the gospel, because that's good news. That instead of being overwhelmed, we can have peace in Jesus. But I'm not going to promise you that everything's going to be perfect from here on out. Sean already did that message. It's not going to be. One day it will be. We have a hope that Jesus is coming back and he will make everything perfect. But right now it's just not that way. So how in the midst of it do you and I endure well? In the midst of feeling overburdened and overwhelmed, how do we stop relying on ourselves and start relying on God? When your relationship starts to fall apart, how do you understand that sometimes you just can't fix it? And you just have to turn to God and pray and ask and hope that he does. When your schoolwork or your future plans or anything starts to crumble or get really, really hard, how do you still give effort but recognize it's not all on you? That you have to rely on God. And relying on God is simply just depending on him. And that's one of the things we're called to do. If we didn't need God, I don't think our existence would look nearly like it does now. But the fact is, we do need God. We're called to be people who are dependent on him, to be in relationship with him, leaning on him, relying on him. And there's this pastor in Texas who, he has this quote, and he says, if dependence on God is the goal, which I believe it is, he says, then weakness is the advantage. And in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul flushes out how weakness can be our advantage. In verse 9, he says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. This is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. He pretty much gave us a list, and he could have just slipped right in there and said overwhelmed and overburdened. He said hardships, persecutions, difficulties. In all of that, when I can't handle it, when it's more than I can handle, in my weakness, now I'm strong. Because that's when we get to rely on God. That's when we get to lean into what he's promised of us. And he has promised to come through. In the first set of verses we read, right before this little section, it says, God is faithful. And for God to be faithful, we have to recognize that while some things we can't handle, they're never more than he can handle. So church, how do we step in and we let him handle it? How do we let him handle those issues that you have, past, present, and future? How do you help find people who are going to let him handle it? Because one of the ways I think God leads us to rely on him is in community. And God's design for life is community. First of all, that's community with him. So if you sit here tonight and you don't have that relationship with him, I need you to stay in this point. Don't at all move on to anything else I say in the rest of the message, because you need to recognize that you need a relationship with God. That in order to rely on him and get through the different things that you may feel overwhelmed and overburdened by, you have to have community with him. But after you get that, I think there's this beauty of life that God leads us to community with others. That there's friends and family, that there's GSM, that there's GracePoint. And in all of that, we can lean on people to rely on them. So when something's overwhelming you and it's overburdened and God has given you more than you can handle, first go to him. Lean into him. Pray to him. Read about him in his word. But also go to community. Tell your friends who love Jesus. It's super important to have friends who love Jesus. Tell your family. Get help if you need it. And this is where I have to speak on something a little bit close to my heart. Mental health is a serious issue, not just for older people. It's a serious issue for everybody. Whether it's anxiety or depression or fill in the blank for anything else. Mental health is something that can make us feel overwhelmed and overburdened. I have friends, I have family members who feel overwhelmed and overburdened, like God has given them more than they can handle. And in that, I pray constantly that they would turn and rely back on God. And that they would turn and rely on me and on others and on their family and on their friends. And if that's you tonight, I pray you would rely on God and you'd rely on others. That it's okay that you feel this way. It's okay that you feel overwhelmed. It's okay that you feel overburdened. But let's move with it. Let's do something with it. And I'm not promising we can fix it, but I'm promising God wants to work on it. This is my last point. Bad things happen to us, but they don't have to define us. In this life, hardship will come. Turmoil will come. People will get sick. You'll lose people you love. Relationships will fall away. School will get hard. Life will get hard. And in all of it, we don't have to let it define us. We can be marked by our relationship with God, living in authentic community. Because God may give you more than you can handle. And sometimes, I pray he does. I pray he gives us more than we can handle so that we can turn to him, and rely on him more. And that we can find authentic community and get loved by the church the way we're supposed to. Pray with me.